Hello everyone. We are at Hunter's home again, and right now we are in the south bedroom and we are talking about some of the things that Susan may have been doing. And basically, she's listed on George's list that he enumerated after the Civil War, his reparations list, you could call it. She was listed on there as a seamstress. So that gives us a pretty good idea of some of the things that she was doing at this point in time. And so generally what we're finding is that you have a seamstress who handles sewing the clothes. She's does the fancier work, the embroidery and things like that that Minerva or the other women of the house aren't going to be handling. They'll do some of those things as a form of, kind of hobby entertainment type thing, continuance of their education, that sort of thing. But for the things that go on to the actual clothes, the lace tatting, the fancier details of those dresses and such, that's going to be what Susan's doing. And on top of that, generally what we're finding is that the enslaved people have their clothes made usually on the plantation. I have found a couple of sources, and maybe other people can tell me more if they found others, that there were some items that could have been ready-made, but for the most part I'm finding information that shows that they purchased the cloth, and Minerva would have overseen and possibly helped with the cutting out of that cloth, and that way she could make sure that there was no waste, because that's one of the ways that the enslaved people were able to kind of fight against their oppression, was that they could sabotage some things like that, the clothing, breaking tools and things like that. And that was one of the ways that they were able to fight back and keep their personal autonomy in a time where, they didn't get to say anything about what was going on, whether it was about the time they woke up, the food that they got to eat, what time they went to bed, or even what they could do with their bodies. And so, there were quite a few different ways that they were able to kind of fight back if they so chose. And so what we see is that to prevent that, the mistress would generally oversee the cutting out of those clothes, and then it would be up to the enslaved women to do the sewing of those clothes. And so they would cut out all the clothes, and then it was time for Susan to sew the trousers, the shirts, things like that. Combing through some of the WPA's enslaved narratives, we can see that they were, some people the kids wore shirts, long-tailed shirts, and that was it. Some kids wore long-tailed shirts and had leather shoes, whether it be cowhide or some of them mentioned goat skin. They had brass button shoes and things like that. So Susan wouldn't have been handling that. That would have likely been a gentleman here on the property who could make that, one of the enslaved men. But she would have been the ones making the shirts. Then they also had, the young ladies wore skirts and blouses. They wore dresses. They had their coats that they could wear in the winter made of various materials. They had socks, gloves, things like that. Now, not only was Susan in charge of making the enslaved clothes, but she also would have been building those larger dresses and the more complicated clothing that George and Minerva Murrell would have worn. Because Minerva, looking at what we know about her and the way her life was, we can see that she had a very busy life. And so, those dresses take a long time to build, especially the fancy ones for the balls and things. And she would have had Susan handling those and doing the fancy work, like the lace tatting and the embroidery and things that embellish those dresses. And then later, of course, Amanda, we have a memory that was written down by Alice Robertson, seeing Amanda getting out of the carriage and going into church one day, and her dress, she talked about it in great detail. And we'll go into that a little bit more too, because there's a chance that it was Susan who was the one that built that dress. And so as we talk, we'll do a video on Amanda, and that's where we'll talk about that dress, and I'll remind everybody about how Susan was likely the one that was built that at the time. All right, so not only was Susan making that stuff, but if they did not purchase the cloth, then Susan and the other enslaved women were the ones that were making the cloth as well. And so what happens is George had sheep. He had merino sheep out here, and so he could sell the sheep, he could sell the meat because they're good for meat and wool production, and then they possibly could have used them for milk as well, sheep's milk, cheese, and things like that. But what they're going to do is they're going to get the sheep, they're going to clean the wool, and we have some wool here. that's been felted, but they'll have wool like this, and they will clean it, and then that provides them with wool similar to this, and then they are going to spin that wool on a spinning wheel, and then depending upon what they want to do, if they want to do it, if they want the wool spun into thread, yarn, or if they want it spun into something that they could knit, for example, or if they want it spun into something that is going to be woven into cloth. And so that's where this loom kind of comes in handy. And so she could have had a loom of this size. It looks like it's not going to make very wide cloth, so most likely they could have had a loom somewhere else. Reading in the enslaved narratives, we see that there were, like, some of the enslaved people had a huge loom in their cabin. Some of them had a weaving room itself that was built off the house sometimes, or it was a hall that they wove in, that kind of thing. But she could have been weaving the cloth or been overseeing herself and the other enslaved women weaving that cloth. And so what happens is we come up with items like this that are, these are hand knitted and spun stockings. And it wasn't an enslaved woman who made this. It was a woman named Harriet Klepper Eoff, and I'm sure I'm butchering that last name, but the last name is E-O-F-F. And so we have some of these things donated to us, and we're able to use them to kind of show what was being done at the time, how it was the kind of things that they were using. And so these are hand knit socks and hand spun wool is what they were knit out of. And then of course we have the mittens here, and Harriet made these as well. And so this is the type of thing that Minerva perhaps could have done, or Susan would have had the working of to do. We also don't know if Susan is the same person that George is listed on the census, because when they lived back in Tennessee, on the census there, it says that George and Minerva are living there in Tennessee, and they have 2 or 4 enslaved people. I believe it's 4, one of which was a weaver. And so if that was Susan, and later he changed her position to a seamstress, maybe because of cost differentiation, because he submitted this list in order to be able to have, money paid back for having lost Susan during the war. And so what I'm finding out is that seamstresses in a lot of cases were worth more in the slavery economy than blacksmiths. And I'm finding notice that blacksmith were sold for $1,500 to $2,000. And so that's how much they were selling people for who had specific sets of skills. Now this is a card set. And so what this is it's a wool, you have wool carders, and you have cotton carders. And so they would card things, and you can see us doing those demonstrations today. We also have shuttles. They have boat shuttles and netting shuttles and things like that. And that's what they would use whenever they were weaving. And then, of course, you have your knitting needles. And this here is a handmade quilt. And we believe it was made by one of the enslaved women on the Little John plantation. And this thing is mind-blowing. It looks like machine made. The detail on it, the way that it's able to have lasted as long as it has, the design on it is just amazing. The pattern, it's quite heavy, so it would have been nice and cozy and warm. Of course, I'm not going to go unfolding it and everything to look at it at the moment, but I mean, you can just see that lovely detail there. in it. And so that would have been someone like Susan who would have been working on that. And so that would have been Susan's job at the time, to make sure that the linens and things for the house were made. And so that was also done, kind of during her off time, if they had off time. And so what we're finding out is that if it was harvest season or planting season, or they had maybe a big dinner party or something like that, there were situations where it was all hands on deck. And so that meant that, if it was time to harvest or plant, and people were getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go out to the fields to harvest or plant or cultivate the fields or something like that, she would have gotten up, she would have gone out to the fields, and she would have worked from sun up until sundown. And then once the sun went down, that was her time to do her other jobs, which would have been the sewing and the weaving and things. That's probably why there were certain times a year whenever they got the cloth and made the majority of the enslaved people's clothes at a certain time of year, because the rest of the time she was busy doing other things. And then, she wouldn't have had time to keep people in clothes, and she wouldn't have had time to make Georgia Minerva's outfits. And of course, they want to make sure that she had time to do those things. And so whenever her day was done doing the rest of the work, that's whenever she went back to her cabin, or she could have lived here in the house. Generally, she would have probably had her own cabin that she lived out, maybe with her husband if she had one, her children if she had them. We just really don't know a whole lot about her beyond her job, and that's how we determine kind of some of the things that she's able to do. We are looking for more information though, and I would like to ask in every video that I can, if you or someone have any histories on descendants of the freedmen, or if you guys have any information on people with the last name of Murrell that could have been descended from the people who were here. We'd love to hear about it, of course. And then so after they weave the cloth and everything, that's whenever they're going to sew. Generally, they're going to sew with a treadle machine. And so that's what this is here. The cords are from the heater, because this place needs a heater in it to take the chill off in the winter. And so they're going to use a treadle sewing machine to work on. And this one is a little bit later than the machines they were using at the time, but it is quite similar to ones that they would use. So that would be her job that she would be doing. And then now we're going to walk through, and we will look at a couple of other places, since this is the upstairs discussion. And so we're walking into the bedroom that we have set up as though a young man's home on school break. And so he would have had, if it was Joshua, he may have had an enslaved person that helped him, unpack. They would have cleaned the rooms and everything. They would have had to make sure that the bed was turned down. If it's winter, they're going to be cleaning the fireplace and everything, making sure the beds are made, the mattresses are cleaned and fluffed. Whenever it's time for those feather mattresses to be cleaned, they take all the feathers out of them and wash them, and then make sure they're nice and clean, and then pop them back into the bed ticking, things like that. And then of course laying out his clothes. Some of Joshua's fondest memories are going fox hunting, so they would have gotten him ready for that. And then he would have had an enslaved person. They had enslaved people that went with them when they were hunting to help gather the birds up that they shot down, their prey and all that. And there would have been enslaved people that were helping with everything. It's just whenever you start to look at it, you see that they're talking about things where they say, we went hunting today. We had a bunch of game that we got. Well, that's a person that's, one of the enslaved people that are the ones that are go and gather the birds up or whatever was shot, and then they go and clean it and process the meat out and all that stuff. And so, those are the kind of things that you stop and think about. It's everything here on this plantation. An enslaved person's hand was upon it. Eliza was touching these things. Sylvia was, Andy. In this room, Peggy, perhaps. We have some toys here set up. And so Peggy would have, she's most likely, we feel, was the nurse for George's and Amanda's child. And you know, she would have had him playing with toys and things like that. Any of the other enslaved children, they may have been raised with him, and so they would have been all kept in one spot where she took care of them and watched over them. And then we have here the balcony door that's where George mentions he was sitting out on, and he was having a whiskey and cigar, and so it would have been Andy that brought that whiskey and cigar out to him as his butler or his manservant. And so those are the kind of things that they were doing at the time. They would have had to go up and open up the clerestory that used to be up here, you know, washing these baseboards, repainting this floor, pulling up the carpets and putting them back down. You know, there was a lot of work to be done. You know, making sure that the ceilings and the walls were dusted, lighting the lamps, making sure those were clean and weren't going to be sputtering, you know, cleaning the gilding off on things, washing down the beds to prevent bed bugs, you know, just all sorts of stuff. They would have been the ones handling it. And it would have started in the morning with them coming in here and laying the fire, cleaning out the ashes, making sure that it was good to go. So whenever Joshua woke up, he was going to wake up to a warm room instead of a cold one. And they'd done the same for Minerva and George. And so those are the kind of things that they were doing back then whenever they were working upstairs. And so that was our discussion on upstairs. Thank you guys for, you know, watching these videos. And if you have any questions or any other topics that you'd like to discuss, or topics within this topic that you'd like to ask questions about, you know, leave a comment down below and we can definitely look into getting those featured in future videos. Thank y'all. Bye-bye.